Hi, and thank you very much for the introduction. Very quick, I'm Benjamin, and I need to find this one first, actually. So here we go. I'm Benjamin, very quick, working at Unacast as a data scientist now for almost 3 years. I have some background in academia for actually a very long time, and now I'm working with geospatial data, location data, and these kind of things, and more about that in the talk.
Yeah, and I'm Andy Sumpter. I'm a retail consultant at Sensormatic, as was said earlier. I believe it's good to surround yourself with people smarter than yourself, and I'm definitely doing that here in this environment. And I do it kind of most days at work, to be honest. The role I get involved in is, from a retailer's perspective, I know how to run retail business and the retail environment. So I work with the data scientists at Sensormatic and data scientists at partner businesses like Unacast, and try to look for the gold within that data for the many kind of global retailers that we work with. So that's what I do. Back to you.
Cool. So let's get started. Very quick, what are we doing at Unacast? So I don't think everybody's familiar with the company. And we are a fairly small company still. Basically startup, scale up in that area right now. We actually doubled our headcount in the last 12 months. So we are rising fast in that sense, and what we are doing is we are analyzing and understanding human mobility. So basically we try to create products that our clients can actually make better decisions around these insights. So what does that mean actually more in a pragmatic sense? So for instance, a product could be a combination of some sort of an insight, of a metric, and of a location. So for instance, let's assume you're interested in a venue. It could also be a brand, an industry code, or a neighborhood, or whatever. It actually doesn't matter so much. But in this case, a venue here. And the location is basically of that venue now described. And this is in Manhattan. You might be interested in a certain metric. This metric here is cross-visitation. So from all people who actually visit this venue, what is the percentage of those people who also visit this venue? Or in this venue or the other one. So you can basically have more insights around kind of like cross-competition with other venues, your competitors, non-competitors, and so on. And this is pretty cool, but this is just a very specific example. And what we want to do is that you actually have the possibility to just, on a map, click somewhere, the location you are interested in, and get insights. That would be amazing. Imagine you are in London in the Royal Geospatial Society, or you are Louvre, Paris, or in New York in Central Park. Basically, just click on the map, or you make a polygon, and suddenly you get insights like, what is the trade area? So the people who are going there, where they're coming from. Or like an index, basically, of those people who are going there, how is this changing over time? What happened with the pandemic? What happened afterwards in the recovery? And so on and so on. So this would be really cool to have that scalable, global. And that's what we are working on, and it's not easy. It's really complicated. So I want to stress that a little bit, that if you have that in mind, you basically need to have a scalable solution which works on every location, every county, every region, every country, everywhere. And that's problematic, because if you think about privacy, privacy is changing. It's not only we're talking about laws, we're also talking about ethics. What is valid maybe in one region might not be valid in another one. So we really need to stress the privacy point here, especially when you're working with GPS data like what we are doing. It's really important to keep that in mind. That's not only privacy, there are also technical limitations like how do you pre-process your data and correct it? Because in every region you get different data. So you need to work with that. You have different market shares. You need to correct for your market share. And then at the end, even if you solved all those problems, you still end up in a situation that you're never 100% sure if it's actually correct what you're doing. So there's this another part, you actually need to have some sort of quality report or confidence intervals. So I tried to go quickly through each of those points. And for me personally, I think that privacy is actually the most important part here. It's really the only way to have this industry going forward is to keep that in mind. Nobody likes creepy following identifiers or GPS signals. So the solution is really privacy friendly. And that's not only just that you bind by the laws. For instance, what we are having at Unacast is an ethics committee. So basically, we have to vet every use case, if that is actually ethically valid, because even if something might be valid by law, we still might not like it. Then I also want to stress the technical aspect. And one thing we are calling supply correction is that if you just take a region, so in this example here, it's New York, state of New York, or here it's DC, and you just take the raw signal and you aggregate it up. This is how it looks like. This looks pretty bad. So imagine you suddenly have like a drop of 20% here, it increases, goes down, it's kind of like madness, and here everything is just declining, and that can't be true. And then you have suddenly something happening here, which is actually true. It's a pandemic effect. So if you just add a low-pass filter to it, you would probably remove the effect you want to keep. So this is something we focus a lot on, and this green line here is basically an automatic correction of all the data which is running of all data automatically. And there are many ways to actually do that. And so if you have questions for more details, please ask. I love it. But very quickly, there are usually 3 approaches a lot of companies use or kind of in the industry. One is, for instance, you restrict a panel. So you basically only take kind of like everything which is good and throw out as much crap as possible. Another one is, I think I gave a talk at the Kato conference 1.5 years ago, where you can basically do a low-pass filter, combine that with a single-value decomposition, and then you run an outlier detection on that to basically correct for it. It's a bit more complicated approach. And another one is that you actually determine the probability of a signal, and you can inverse it and use that as a multiplier. And we do all 3 of those at Unacast. So, and then there's the next thing. Now you corrected your data, but now you still have a problem that actually in every region you might have a different market share. So you might see more people or basically identifiers in the UK compared to France. So if you're still just aggregating things up and you're comparing the venue in Paris to the venue in London, you can't compare it because you have different underlying market shares. So this is where you then have to do another part. For instance, for each hexagon, you could basically calculate what is the population in the hexagon and what's the actual population we are seeing in our data. And then you can use that to correct your data. And then we come to the last part of those 4 problematic points when you want to have a scalable solution, and that's the confidence interval. So now all the pre-processing is done, you're happy with that, but you're still not 100% sure. Can I just trust everything which is running during the night and all those calculations? Probably not. So what we are doing is, for instance, we take the square footage of a point of interest or basically of the location you're defining. We also take the median device count we are seeing, and we also basically run a signal detection algorithm. So we basically track the signal over time and try to find how much this actually represents a pattern or versus noise. It's not good. If it's just noise, then it's strange. And then we get a coefficient between 0 and 1, where 1 is like, yeah, we are super happy. 0 is like, you probably want to actually check what is happening here. Yeah, so then we get the check here. We have something which is scalable and which is working. We are happy with that. And then we come to the actually interesting part. And that is, this was all pre-processing, right? What is actually the metric? What can you use with this data and what's the insight? So I want to showcase 2 different metrics which we are using a lot. One is the trade area, as you can see here. And it's actually fairly simple. So for those who are not familiar with trade areas or catchment areas or whatever you call it, you basically take a venue of interest, and this is actually a Primark in Birmingham. And for all devices in there, you basically check the share, kind of like how many people are coming from which region. So in this case, it's based on hexagons. You can run it on census block groups or administrative boundaries. That actually doesn't matter so much. And now you basically have, you know how many devices or people are coming from that area, and you know the total devices going to that venue, so you can just calculate the fraction, and then you have the share of this. And the cool thing is, you can run it for certain time windows again and again. And then you use Car2 Builder and can make a nice visualization of that actually, how this Primark changed the trade area over time when it opened in April 2019 and pandemic effects and so on. And then you can have some insights around the trade area and how it changes. But could be any other area as well. And another very interesting metric we're using a lot is the traffic index. So basically, this is less on a spatial level as the trade area, which is really spatial, right? This is more like a timeline. So you're basically interested kind of like how traffic is changing over time for a location. And also here, pre-processing, super important. Because if you don't do the pre-processing, actually this line here is the raw data, and you see that there are differences. And these differences can actually really impact your results. Because basically here, there's a different supply level than later in time, and if you don't correct for those things, you can't compare, and you suddenly would find like, oh, here everything is higher than before the pandemic. Well, that's actually not true. So those are things to keep in mind when working with the data. And I think, oh, by the way, this is actually normalized by a constant. So basically, the idea is to have an index you can compare to any other location in the world and also to any other point in time. So we basically do a normalization on this data on top to ensure that you can actually just compare stuff as you like. And then I would give it to Andy.
Thank you very much. So I just want to take a few minutes really to talk about some of the work we've been doing in combining data sets from Sensormatic and ShopperTrak with Unacast. For those of you who don't know Sensormatic, we're a retail service business. We work in the loss prevention field, so we have lots of data on shrinkage and alarms that are being set off in retailers around the world. We work in the inventory field, so we have mountains of data on inventory and the movement of inventory and sales and so on. And lastly, and probably most relevant for today, we work in the traffic field. So any of the stores you go into or shopping centres, there's usually devices over the top which will count you in to a super high degree of accuracy. So before I talk about how we've collaborated together, I just want to talk about the very rich data we have at the moment. And also the limitations of that. So as you'll see on screen, we track the largest amount of footfall traffic globally and to a super high degree of accuracy, as I've mentioned before. And there's over 150,000 devices, let's say, in retail stores and in shopping centres. And that is across the globe, and pre-pandemic, actually, we were probably counting upwards of 50 billion shopping visits per annum. And from the question earlier, that varies very much across the globe of how we've come back to the current status. But in the UK, we're probably sitting around about 10% below pre-pandemic. But there's been changes going in the retail space for many years, obviously with the expansion of e-commerce, click and collect, and so on. So one of the areas we looked at with Unacast was we picked a sample site, and we're just going to mention for a moment some of the opportunity from a retail perspective of what you can do with some of the Unacast data. We picked the Primark store in Birmingham, which we looked at earlier. For those of you who don't know, Primark is a value retailer, and the site in Birmingham is actually the world's largest apparel retailer. It used to be previously, it was a shopping centre, which was not the greatest of shopping centres in Birmingham, but they actually took over the whole of the location. I think it's 4 or 5 floors, and it's a phenomenal offering for what you think is a value retailer. You can also go and get your nails done, you can have a hair appointment, there's a Disney franchise in there, you can have custom t-shirts built. You know, these are the kind of changes that retailers are doing now to get people to come into physical present stores. And as you can see on the screen here, it opened in April, and we've been able to go back and have a look at the impact on Birmingham City Centre and on this particular location. And the first 3 periods, it's pretty mediocre in that space, and of course Primark opens, there's a complete frenzy and people queue around the corner, and you can see a phenomenal amount of activity in that space. And that continues for a number of months, kind of settles, but then kind of drops through the floor. And this is, of course, as the first kind of restrictions came in from the pandemic. And I'm not sure how clear it is actually on up here, but this is the kind of the timeline of the restrictions in the UK and the lockdowns, and it very closely correlates with that. Well, it exactly correlates with that, of course. But the advantage of this kind of data over the typical kind of census data that we work in Sensomatic is we have the opportunity to do this historically. We talked about this a matter of weeks ago, and you don't need hardware for this. We've been able to kind of look at the impact that this retailer has had on the city centre retrospectively and look at kind of the opportunity that Primark have brought to the city centre. The other kind of areas which we're particularly interested in, I think a number of retailers are interested in, is also beginning to understand the kind of what we class as the full shopper journey. And we're an American business, so they call it from couch to store, back to couch again. But what they're really talking about is essentially where are your customers coming from? What do they do when they're browsing on their phone, sat at home, decide to make a purchase, but they go to collect it? Where are they coming from? When they visit your store, where do they go afterwards, or where do they go beforehand? These are the sort of things which retailers are asking us, and with additional data sets such as what we have with Unacast, we're starting to begin to be able to answer some of these questions. The next one here is dwell time. I think somebody else was discussing dwell time earlier. There's not necessarily a right or wrong dwell time, but it's very powerful information, understanding how long your customers spend in your store, how long they spend in competitors' store, and what's the optimum dwell time. Are customers spending a lot of time there because they're spending a lot of money, or are they spending a lot of time there because they're queuing and not finding what they want? These are all very useful additions and metrics for a retailer to look at. And the last point here is the trade area. Understanding not just the impact and the activity on your site. We can do that very comfortably on our own. We have the sensors and devices, and retailers love data, so they have a lot of data about what's happening at their site. But with this, we can start to look at what's happening at our competitors and what's happening in the area. If our store's underperforming, is that an inward issue where we need to focus on the store, or is it actually a location issue? Which leads to the kind of collaboration point, really. So what we've been doing with Unacast is putting both data sets together and really trying to validate mobility data with the kind of what we call the ground truth data of what we have. And we worked with a global sports retailer with their site on Oxford Street. They've got a fantastic flagship store there. What we did in isolation is we took the footfall patterns of that retailer on Oxford Street. Unacast provided us with data of their mobility data to overlay, and we had some fantastic, obviously very different number sets, but the correlation between the trends was very, very close. And we went on to additional stores, but we had kind of 94%, 85, 80%. Level of correlations between those trends. I think really what that enables us to do is to have a confidence in that mobility data in isolation then. So if this retailer wants to understand what's happening further down the road, they have their own ground truth data, they can have confidence in the mobility data in a close proximity, and then they can apply that to areas where they don't have that ground truth data and start to understand what's happening with their customers or their potential customers. That's pretty much it for me. What would be really good if we have time would be, I know there's lots of data scientists in here. I know there's also some retailers in here. It'd be really interesting to understand if this is of interest or if there's other areas which would be of use, but I'll open for questions. Thank you. Or not. Oh.
Thanks. A question, and when will the sessions are here as well? Thank you. Andy, I think this is a question for yourself and also for one of the presenters. I think it was SafeGraph earlier. I understand all these scenarios given are where you've got a site and there's a store at that site and it's a single location. So now Walmart was given, for example, or Primark. How do you handle the challenge where you have like a shopping mall? We've got multiple stores sitting vertically on top of each other, latitude, longitude, a ground floor and a first floor, and differentiate some of the footfall data. And earlier for SafeGraph, some of the consumer spend data. How do you deal with that challenge?
I'm going to pass on the kind of technical aspect of that. Of course, what we would bring to the table in that data environment is we collect data at the perimeters of shopping centres as well. We also collect the data of multiple retailers, so we can start to have a good ground truth on what's happening within that space just with our own data alone. I'm then going to kick over the complicated question to Benjamin about the heights.
Due to the nature of, in this case, GPS data. So if you have several floors, it's basically for us impossible to basically distinguish those. This is why we are basically giving numbers for the building itself or for basically the area of interest. The other distinction is very hard. We do a few things to actually remove errors. For instance, we are detecting homes and work locations in the same building and remove them, so that we at least get the workers and kind of like residents out of it, because sometimes you have a store down and upstairs is basically kind of like, it's a residential building too. But then if you think about malls and those huge malls and what's happening inside there, there's actually, for instance, Sensormatic has them probably the better insights, and we are better kind of like for the whole building and outside maybe what's happening. So there's a good collaboration actually with those data sets.
That might have started the next project, thanks.
I'm just wondering if retailers have any interest to use the data you're producing to calculate their environmental impact?
I'm sure they are. I'm not going to speak on behalf of other retailers, but there's very few retailers who aren't addressing the kind of environmental impact of their stores. I guess another angle, which might have started another project, is I guess calculating the environmental impact of physical presence stores versus I'll just have it delivered from a warehouse in 1,000 miles away for a single box with lots of cardboard around it. That's a study that I don't know how much is available on that, but retail is I would imagine a more environmentally friendly way to shop in mass. But I'm sure there's retailers who are looking at those questions for sure. And also the local deliveries as well. Having lots of retailers are also fulfilling deliveries locally as well. So, what's the environmental impact of that? How far are their delivery drivers going or being collected? So, it's a great question.
Maybe one short thing. So, but since we had the question before about the analysis of what happened after the pandemic and recovery, actually was last year at the Cato conference. So it's I guess it's on YouTube to find. A great presentation from Jan Benitka. He's a really great scientist, and he gave a presentation around the recovery and if things have recovered and so on, from a non-commercial perspective, more from a public perspective. So.
Awesome.
Thank you.
I think that's all our questions. Thank you, guys.